Hi, therapy issuers. Thank you for joining in on our conversation between licensed mental health professionals. This is not meant to substitute a relationship with a licensed mental health professional. Should you become triggered or begin experiencing a mental health crisis, please go to your nearest mental health hospital, emergency room, or dial 911 or 988. And always remember, we are human first and therapist second. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube channel using the handle at Crave Counseling. This is Therapy Ish. Welcome back to another episode of Therapy Ish. And today we have Danisha Baro, and we'll be talking about challenges within a toxic academic system. So, Miss Danisha, can you please introduce yourself and tell everyone where you're located, what you do, and how you can be reached?
Sure. My name's Danisha Baro. I'm currently residing in Boston, Massachusetts for my pre-doctoral internship. But before I moved to Boston, I was living in Las Cruces, New Mexico for my doc program. Before then, was living in Killeen, Texas as a licensed mental health provider. And before then, in New York City, also as a licensed mental health provider. So I've been around up to most places in the East Coast and Southwest and South. But currently, I'm a pre-doc intern, but also have my private practice where I'm licensed in Texas and New York. So I see folks via telehealth on either of those states. And I can be reached on Psychology Today or via email. So if anyone wants to reach me in that way, they can.
All righty, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your social media handles?
Sure. All of my social media handles are my first, middle initial, and last name. So Danisha C. Baro.
All righty. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. All right, so we'll just jump right in. So, the first question that I have for you is, what are the most significant challenges faced by graduate students in mental health programs, and how does the system's design, whether through outdated structures or systematic biases, fuel these struggles?
That's a really great question. And I'll answer just based on my own personal experiences and some conversations I've had with other folks in other programs. But three of the most significant things that I've noticed is lack of diversity amongst faculty. From what I've observed, even before applying for my master's and doc program, majority of faculty are white. There's little folks of color that are faculty members, so the representation isn't entirely there. And from my personal experience in my doc program, I've had three advisors over the span of the almost 4 years that I've been in the program.
Hmm.
Because I came in with a master's, I had the option of doing 4 years instead of five. So I opted to do the 4 years. And in the years that I've been so far, I've had three, but usually we're supposed to have one throughout. So that in itself says a lot about just the state of academia right now. I've also been looking back for my own curiosity of the folks that I was applying for. When I was applying for doc programs, I just wanted to check and see what those faculty members are doing, if they're still in academia or not, or what they're essentially doing right now. But two of the folks that I applied for who are Black women left academia. So that also speaks to just what's happening right now. And systemically, from my experience, most institutions just aren't really meeting the diversity, not only just in faculty, but in student population and also in the curricula. A lot of what we learn are dated, and I understand it's part of what we have to learn, but there could be some incorporation of other factors that aren't being incorporated. And I also think that maybe finances plays a role. From what I've also been told by mentors and faculty members in the past, academia just isn't what it is financially, and a lot of people just find a lot more fruitful experiences outside of academia. So I think that also plays a role.
Well, which is always interesting to me because universities get research grants, they get all of this money.
Hmm.
And it's like, I understand that a part of it has to go to like facilities, right? Like making sure that the building is updated and making sure everything is where it needs to be. But then on the flip side of that, it's like, okay, we're getting research grants at the institution, but I'm doing free research, which is going to get into our next question anyway. And then you
Hmm.
guys are selling it on EBSCO. I'm doing this work for free. One, two, I'm tapping into populations that the university probably wouldn't have access to because there's not a black
Hmm.
face or a brown face in front. And then on top of that, I'm on this campus and I'm paying tuition plus the research grant. So one plus
Right.
one is not equaling two for me.
Hmm. And that's two of my other points that I have with that question. The financial strain. I mean, just personally, it's just been hard, even as a master's student, working for free, like you mentioned, specifically in mental health programs. You work for experience, but then you may or may not get an assistantship to pay for your financial need, which that in itself is pretty low. It's not necessarily going to be what you entirely need to survive, to pay rent, to pay groceries. There's been times where I've had to be on government assistance just to be able to sustain while in the program. And all of that plays a role in just satisfaction and time that you have to complete
Yeah.
academic
Yeah.
requirements.
So what I'm hearing you say on the first question though is the design in which is keeping or making it just very challenging for students going into graduate programs. One is diversity. I think that also too plays a role in the number of students getting admitted into the programs. Of course, finances is a huge aspect of it, but primarily it's like, okay, well, if I don't have people in the higher level roles that I'm seeking to be in, or just even having access to mentorship within the program from people that look like me, how likely am I to complete the program? How much will I endure in the program? And what would be the quality of my outcome?
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, next question. So, mental health programs ask students to work unpaid hours, shoulder excessive workloads, and navigate systemic inequalities, all while claiming to train them to champion well being. How do we expect students to thrive when the system itself seems to contradict its own mission?
And you're absolutely right. It is a contradiction, and it never made sense to me as a student. And even while being in the field, it still doesn't make sense. So after I completed my master's program, I didn't go straight into completing my doc program. I took some time in between to get experience and get licensed. A lot of what I've noticed within mental health programs is what I experienced in the field. There's this expectation of productivity and doing what you can for money, for a high turnaround for the business that you're working for or whatever institution you're working for. But there is little consideration for your own mental health well-being or what's
Mhm.
sustainable for your work-life balance. And I think that our system educationally is already the same with what we'll see in the mental health system, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable, but I'm not still not entirely sure how we can help with mitigating that. But it sucks that what I've experienced in academia is pretty much the same as what I've seen in most mental health institutions.
Yeah. And I will say, like, some of the internship placement sites, they don't really train you from what I know. Thankfully, that wasn't my experience. I did my training at I was in the school district as a former educator, so I got my experience with the school counselors on campus. But I also was like a rape crisis victim advocate in Tarrant County at the Women's Center. And baby, they wouldn't even let me go out to a hospital until they trained me well, like until they felt
Right.
like I could do it on my own, considering the delicacy of the situation in which I would be supporting with. And so it's kind of like that. Like if you think about the programming and placements and all those things, it's like most people, from what I hear, right, are placed at internship sites or practicum sites in which they're working 20 to 40 hours for free, unpaid, because a lot of these
Mhm.
organizations or nonprofit are nonprofit, and they say, "Oh, well, you can come get your hours over here. We got plenty of people for you." And it's like you come over there, but then you're working 20, 30, 40 hours by yourself, and you're not really getting the guidance that you're supposed to get. I always tell people, like, if you can get your internship hours at a private practice for the first semester, whether it's practicum or internship one, and then try to get your follow-up hours maybe at a different type of agency base so that you have both pieces of experience. But yeah, you're right. Like, we're taught that, well, in our code of ethics, everybody's code of ethics, it pretty
Right.
much says, practice self-care. Take time for yourself, put
Mhm.
yourself first, the things. But how do you do that when you're working for organizations that are pushing numbers? Like you mentioned, like that's the part that most people don't know about when they get into their program. Like programs, well, when I was coming out of my program, I don't know if it was the same when you came out. The conversation is always make sure that, well, when you leave here, you're gonna go work for an agency. It was never a, you're gonna go into private practice, you're gonna do these things, da 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 da. Like there are no other alternatives. If you're coming through this program, you're coming to do the dirty work in the
Mhm.
field, basically. And it's like, I don't think that we were actually taught how to practice self-care in our
Not
programs.
at all.
And a part of that had to do with the number of hours required, right? Like some people are having to get 600 hours in a semester, depending on the program. And then others is 300, 300, and then, the 100 for practicum. So it's just like, we're telling you, you have to get these 40 hours and come to class and probably still maintain a full-time job. And it's just like, that doesn't help me because most people that look like me, we already have two and three jobs going through the program. And then on top of that, you want me to get a third job? And I'm probably, whether I'm a wife, whether I'm a mom, whether I'm a dog mom, whether it's just me. That is a lot to ask for from one person and still have to do the classwork.
Mhm. I I'm smiling just because I understand everything that you're saying and have experienced the same too. Even in my dark program, there's been a lot more conversation about self-care, but in past experiences, there hasn't been that conversation. And when I graduated and got my first job out of my master's program, it felt like it was a shock for me just being in an environment that was so toxic and not being able to set boundaries, just learning how to set boundaries in the workplace was new for me. And I wish those
Mhm.
conversations were part of what we were talking about in class. Not that what we were exploring isn't important, but in addition to it would have been more helpful.
Yeah, especially because it's like, okay, well, if you don't graduate, that means our numbers are going to be messed up and we can't have that.
Mhm.
So therefore, you got to finish regardless of everything you got going on. So, or you can take a break and then come back when you think you can do it. Ooh, it's hard though. It's hard because you want to be the new face in the industry that is not already out there for people coming behind us. But it's so hard when you are, pushing excessive workloads and then possibly dealing with systematic inequalities. Of course, we're we're already coming in as an inequality aspect, right?
Right, right.
From an
Mhm.
aspect of inequality, but from a financial standpoint, that just adds to it, and it doesn't make it helpful. So, graduate programs are often sold as a path to personal and professional growth. But for many students, especially those from minority and underserved backgrounds, they become a source of burnout and disillusionment. What structural changes can disrupt this cycle?
Community has been really helpful for me personally, but
Mhm.
has been a process.
Slim to
Um,
none.
right? It's a process. When I did my master's program in New York City, as far as my cohort, predominantly white, same with my doc program, but I had New York City and I was able to
Exactly.
maneuver around and do things that I enjoyed, even with limited funds. There were still a lot of free options, and more people look like me. There were I'm Afro-Latina. There's a lot more Afro-Latinos in New York City and folks from other parts of the world that are also Black. But in Las Cruces, New Mexico, that wasn't
Mhm.
part of what I was seeing, or even part of Las Cruces. Really, I would probably see one Black person every other week.
Mhm.
And speaking Spanish, I know I'm Black before I'm Latina, but my identity is more recognized in the Northeast, or even I was raised in Miami, so it's more recognized, and people know there's Black people in Latin America, but in Las Cruces or in New Mexico, it just was pretty hard to find community. So
Yeah.
it took my last year of living there, my third year, until I finally found some community and people that I was able to hang around. But that was for me prioritizing fitness. I used
Yeah.
fitness as a way to de stress. So I was doing martial arts
Mhm.
on the side to help with my stress from the program. And that's what folks do there. And then from my main gym, I was walking all the time. So from there, I met some cool folks and I created community from there. Not to
Mhm.
say that I didn't have a community in my program, but I wanted something outside of the program to just not have to talk about school or just have
Right.
other things in common.
Yeah.
So without community, I don't know how, honestly, don't know
Yeah.
how I would have.
I will say that I think the reason why so many people are successful at completing undergrad is because a lot of students in undergrad, like there's more diversity in undergrad, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And,
I think so.
when you think about going into the graduate programs, your hope is that the graduate programs would look exactly like the undergrad programs. And so when you think about like professional growth and prevention of burnout and disillusionment, when you're in undergrad, the fight is different. The fight is very different because your
Oh,
friends
for
will
sure.
not allow you to fall. They just won't. It's like, girl, no, we going to class today. I don't care how you feel. We going, oh, I'm pulling up at your mama house. We about to study today. Or like, y'all pull up, we gonna eat dinner. I got $5 for this, you got $5 for that. Let's make two things happen, right? It
Hmm.
definitely helped with getting through undergrad. But as you get into graduate school, there's one or two things happening depending on your program, right? There are students that are married, stay-at-home moms, or husbands that have very flexible careers that are going into the
Hmm.
industry. And then there's us.
Yeah.
We are in the trenches trying to get through these programs and trying to push out, all the paperwork we need to complete, and all the things. And it's just like, it's so hard. Like, I grew up in
It really
Dallas,
is.
so like it's very Black and Hispanic or Latinx, right? And so like I grew up kind of speaking Spanish. Hablo español, pero no hablo
Mm.
mucho o más, right? Um,
I mean, you sound great.
but my technical Spanish is not good, so I don't do therapy in Spanish. But when I was in
Mhm.
Dallas, I very much well spoke Spanish majority of the day because that's the neighborhood that I lived in and that's the community that I served. And that's the neighborhood I grew up in, right?
Mhm.
But then I moved to Austin and it's like I don't even get to necessarily practice my Spanish often. Um, Not only from an aspect of now people have choice, right? I'm not saying people didn't have choice in Dallas, but in Dallas, we were one. Like there was no difference between
Mhm.
Latinx and Black. Like we family. But like in Austin, that is very different. Which was a culture shock to me because it wasn't the same. It's not the same. Like I don't really have a lot of friends. Like I have a friend now, like I didn't even know she was Afro Latina until like we were messaging on Instagram and she was like, "Yeah, girl, my daddy Puerto Rican and da 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 da." My dad and then I got another friend like her dad's from Cuba. And I'm just like, "Bro, you speak Spanish?" And she was like, "Yeah." I'm like, "We could have been talking in Spanish." But I said all that to say is that when you see like a Black person in Austin, you anticipate that they're just Black, right? Like they don't speak Spanish or any. But in Dallas, like it's normal to come across somebody that speaks some type of Spanish, even if it's like
Mhm.
the intro to Spanish, right? and it's so different because I'm so used to navigating and having conversations with parents, even if my Spanish was kind of broken, to where now I don't even use it at all. And the neighborhoods are so very segregated in Austin as
Mhm.
well. Um,
They are.
and that also adds to the programs, but that's neither here nor there.
Having I worked in Austin, but was living in Killeen, so commuting to Austin and just observing that segregation. And yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And it seemed a lot more white than other parts of Texas that I was around, other cities in Texas.
Yeah, and even in Killeen, because I live in Killeen now, I commute to Austin once or twice a week. It it gives me Dallas vibes, if that makes sense. So like the Blacks and Latinx
Mhm.
community, we're all together. So you see it more, but the Latinx community here doesn't really speak that much Spanish, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, yeah.
I mean, of course, unless you're in certain industries, you might see Spanish more than others, but in mental health, you don't really see it often. Mostly in El Paso, places like San Antonio, you see more Spanish or bilingual clinicians in those areas. Not to say Austin doesn't have them. It's just it's not it's not heavy. You don't see it heavily like you do in those two main major cities here and in Houston. Houston has a lot of bilingual clinicians. All right, so next question. This is probably gonna be my favorite question. So power dynamics between faculty, supervisors, and students often leave little room for advocacy or dissent. How do these dynamics perpetuate toxicity in mental health programs, and what can be done to shift the balance of power?
So I haven't experienced this too much in my doc program, but in past experiences and with other folks that I've talked to, hierarchies perpetuates power dynamics. So, for example, with relationship with your advisor, I've experienced just it's hard to even ask a question
Mm,
because of expectations of me, or there isn't that collaborative approach in the relationship with my mentor or advisor. It wasn't specifically with an advisor at the time, it was more so I was in a research lab. So with this person, it was hard to really approach them or ask questions. Any question felt like I was incompetent or not good enough. So I was scared to even say anything in any of those meetings. And the way that it was set up, the master's students were sitting outside of the circle. So
mhm.
the doc students in that research lab were sitting on a
Like
table
in the
with that
forefront.
professor, and then mhm,
Mhm.
and then the master's students were sitting in the back around the table. So that in itself, even visually, was off-putting for me. So I particularly didn't really ask any questions or wasn't as engaged as I usually am. So I think having a collaborative approach with your mentees or advisees is really helpful. With my advisors that I've had, even in my master's program and doc program, they've been very collaborative and have met me halfway. So that's been refreshing. But I've heard from other folks that that hasn't always been the case, and it's hard to go through the program. I mean, I've always been told before applying for doc programs that your advisor, you basically are quote unquote married, not legally in any way, obviously, but
Mhm, mhm.
they're going to get you through
Oh,
the
yeah.
entire program. So if you both don't have a good working relationship, then it's not going to be an easy
Yeah.
time in your program. Um, so for me, collaboration with your advisor is really important. Amongst students in my past experiences, there's a competitive spirit, unconscious or conscious, that is around the
Really?
cohort. So yeah, so it could be like competing for certain positions or practicums or different
Mm.
opportunities after you graduate, or opportunities that some people get over other people. And that just creates a lot of competitive spirit among the cohort that also isn't helpful to the
Yeah.
learning environment. Thankfully, I haven't experienced that in my doc program. I think I'm not sure exactly what about the culture has created this dynamic, but it's been helpful, refreshing to not have that added layer on top of
Yeah.
all the other stuff we have to worry about.
I always tell people, like, I'm so thankful for my program. Although it was a Southern Baptist University here in Texas, that the faculty and staff was 99% white, right? They very much well operated in a very Christian way, healthy Christian, right? And of course, Dallas Baptist University, so it's a Baptist university, at least my experience. Like, our advisors were also our professors. So if you were struggling, your professor knew it because they were your advisor. And they didn't play no games with us. Those little ladies at the campus, they popped up at our sites. It wasn't like I talked about this previously with somebody else, like briefly, kind of in passing, but like the programs now are not the same as what we had 10 years ago when I first came out. The programs that are out now, they're pumping numbers just like we do in the field
Mhm.
to make money. It's mental health, since it's now a kind of like IT, right? Like when IT became a big thing, universities came up with programs overnight and were pushing these
Right.
programs, and now we have an excess of engineers. Now we still have a shortage of mental health providers because we all do something
Mm.
very different, but it's like now we have programs that are pushing people out, and so that power dynamic becomes worse because it's like,
Mhm.
well, you have to finish and it has to look like this, because if it doesn't
Right.
look like this, it messes up our metrics with accreditation, one, and then two, it messes up my numbers as a professor in how I work with my students, and I can't have that. And so it's like that power struggle becomes worse. And then in addition to that, I think the easiest way in which we can pivot the power struggle, one, is to get away from these online mental health based programs. We
Oh, for
absolutely
sure.
have to. It is convenient, yes. But like a more healthier hybrid approach, like maybe in person once a month, maybe not weekly, because that is a lot, because we all work, at least we do. Um, and then it's like, okay, doing that, but also showing up. Don't just see me in class, tell me it has to be done this way, but not come in and put feet on the ground, right? But because the system doesn't pay well, they too work. So they can only operate within the constraints of their schedule. So it's like the professors that we had, they were professors and advisors. Now, I don't know how they was getting paid, but my
Mhm.
tuition was high. I'm gonna just say that. But they did offer minority scholarships. I'll say that too. But on the flip side of that, it's just like they had the time and the energy. They were retired, they were no longer in the field, but also they had access to quality practicum sites
Right.
because those ladies had time to go out into the field. And I'm only saying ladies because we only had female professors at the time. But I said all that to say is that we can shift it by one, putting money where it goes, where it's supposed to go. To add to what you're saying, but also two, we have to come out of these online based programs. Yes, it's inconvenient, and I know somebody would shoot me down if they saw me saying it in public. I get it. But at the same time, it's my experience is very different than what my students and my practicum
Mhm.
students experiences are now coming out of the programs. They're stressed, they're overwhelmed, they feel this added pressure. I talked about this in one of my like previous videos, about like how I almost didn't graduate, but my advisor knew me personally because she was my professor.
Mhm.
She was in the field monitoring me, and she was my advisor. And because she knew my situation, she basically was like, "We're not going to charge you tuition." Whereas nowadays, these online programs, you're getting charged tuition if you miss that deadline or if you don't pass that
Mhm.
class. She said, "I'm going to file an extension for you on your behalf." Okay, sis, you're going to come
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
next semester. You're going to come into this class, this section. You're not paying tuition for this class or this section. You're just going to relearn the information, and you're going to complete your comps. And I'm not charging you for another class. And you're going to graduate on time because it's an incomplete versus re-enrolling in the class. But because we had a relationship and she saw how she saw me, right? She saw me only then. was I able to really succeed and excel how I needed to? Not that I would not have without her guidance, it just would have looked different. But because there was no power struggle, it was like, no, I'm your mentor. This happens sometimes. It's okay. I understand that you're working, you're taking care of nieces and nephews. You're navigating all these changes, and it's like, that's okay. I'm going to make sure you see it through.
And I think that that part is really important. Without my advisor for my master's program right now, like you said, the personal piece to it, you're a person outside of this and you have dreams, goals, desires, hobbies. Everything isn't academia. And that's not the only thing you're doing or interested in. Without that, I don't think that there's any like empathy. And that, I mean,
Mhm.
empathy is one of the main things that we're being taught now of.
No, you cannot
This is
teach
some,
empathy. Come on now. There's
I
been a
mean, for
huge debate
some,
about it. You can't teach empathy. You can't.
fair. That's fair. But for some, I mean, it comes a little harder than others. But but I mean, that in itself is what has helped personally, what has helped me
Mhm.
to just get through all of this if it wasn't for caring about me as a person and what
Mhm.
I need in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Not only say you can't teach empathy because I feel like either you have it or you don't. And the people who typically don't, they don't care to have it. Not intentionally,
Mhm,
it's just a subconscious, okay, they can do better, they can change, they can do, that's the
mhm,
mindset, right? Like it's very black or white. Whereas individuals who have empathy, we operate within the gray space. So either you have it or you
mhm.
don't. So if you're a person that doesn't know how to operate within the gray space, depending on what it is, you're less likely to have it. No matter how much I try to coach you and teach you into having it, if
Mhm.
you're operating from a belief of people can do better.
What you mentioned earlier, what we're thinking more about, or programs are thinking more about numbers and money versus quality. And to me, when I mentioned, I completely agree with what you said. I do think it's something that's within you and not necessarily something that's taught. But we do have therapists out there that aren't living by what a therapist is supposed to be or what we should offer. And sometimes empathy, like you said, it does lack, and unfortunately, we see what we're seeing sometimes.
Mhm. So I guess we kind of answered part of this next question, but we can just ponder over it again. Faculty often hold the keys to create a more supportive environment, yet toxic practices still persist. What meaningful steps can faculty take to better support students from marginalized communities, and how can these students fight back when those systems fail them?
I think some of the same, like you mentioned, some of the same things that we talked about, just that understanding that one, I'll take it back. I think every person in our field has to be through a cultural humility journey. And without that journey, it impacts not only the clients that you see, but the students and supervisees that you supervise. So without that consideration, none of what we're talking about is really going to be helpful, especially for students that you're helping to be the next generation. So starting from there, that also includes advocating for students. For example, in my program, with everything that we do, most students, including myself, were not able to participate in this, but there is a graduate student um, union. So I guess they unionize for our needs and specifically
Mm,
mostly finances and making sure that we don't pay for tuition because of all the other things that we contribute to the school. But through their fight, and now there's been faculty members that have from my program that have joined in on that, and they have spoken to different folks in the institution about what our needs are as graduate students, including making sure that we don't pay for tuition, given that most of us do work for the university or teach, um, or other things that would be helpful for us throughout our time in the institution. But there's been some faculty members that have provided support or have written letters or have been there during rallies. So seeing that has been really refreshing. I haven't been in other spaces where that's been the case or have heard of other programs or folks from other programs that have had that type of setup, but just seeing faculty in my program joining and assisting in that has been different in a good way. That to me shows, okay, you're not about just writing down all the things that we need or things that would be better. You're actually doing what it is and what it takes to make things better in our program and our overall experience. So, on top of just doing things interpersonally, I think systemically it's helpful to advocate for your students and making sure that they're not being utilized in ways that are harmful.
Yeah. I think other steps that individuals with working within higher education can also do is like work towards creating our own programs. There are not a lot of black and brown faces out there because there are not doctoral level programs at every HBCU you come across,
Mhm.
right? Most HBCUs have like an undergrad in psychology or social work or something of the nature, and then that probably cuts to anywhere from 50 to 75% maybe have a master's program in mental health or social work. And then when you get to the doctoral level, that's probably down to like 10 to 30%, right? And so it's like when I was searching for doctoral programs, one of the main reasons why I took a step back was one, the financial aspect of it. Like I'm not paying $96,000 for a doctoral program. Um, when the field doesn't pay what physicians pay. And I think a lot of the conversations that we kind of have to continue to have is just making the community aware of the work that gets put in. Cause like when people think, oh, like I'm gonna get a therapist, I'm gonna see if she can do 50. Like I can't do 75, but I'm gonna see if she can do 50 or
Mhm.
whatever the situation is. It's like, okay, I hear you, I understand. I know that, your financial situation is important to you, but it is important to me as well. So, do I advocate for myself and just say, "Hey, like I do just about the same amount of time as it would to go into medical school. I do 4 years of undergrad, they do 4 years of undergrad. I take an exit level exam, they take an exit level exam, and then we take graduate exams, right? Or, in undergrad, it's graduate exam or the GRE or the MCAT, whatever. Then when we get into the program, if we get admitted, right, it's just as competitive as medical school. Once we get in, then we have to do 3 to 4 years of a master's program. Most people complete their master's in 3. Medical school is typically 3 to 4 years, depending on the school. Then you finish your program and you take comps, they take comps, but then you also take your licensing exam. They take the medical board exams. We take our clinical exam, depending whether it's the NCE, whether it's the NCMHCE, whether it's the social work exam, whatever exam you take, or MFT exam, whatever. Then we still have to do 3 years of internship, 2 to 3, or 18 months to, depending on your state, to 3 years. So do physicians. They have to go through 3 to 4 years of residency, depending on the program. So it's like physicians, yes, they save lives, so do we, right? It just looks different. But on the other side of that, it's just like the amount of debt they got into is the same amount of debt we got into, if not more. And then you want me to take $25?
That's my also biggest issue too, or just not only from if you do self-pay, but from insurances.
Yes.
Our insurance claims are completely different from medical providers, and that in itself is just frustrating because, like you said, we have similar steps to get our degrees and to get certified in certain areas, and we're not considered to be as
Mhm.
important or
Now, I love my physicians. Don't get me wrong. So don't take this conversation as like a bad thing. It's just highlighting what's happening and why you see
Mhm.
clinicians coming out of the field and why there aren't good mentors out in the field. But then it's like when you go to your therapist, you're with them for at least an hour. I know everything wrong. I can tell your whole mood is off when you come in here. And I see you probably every week, twice a week, every other week, once every 3 weeks, however often we see each other. But you go to a physician, You see them for 15 minutes, maybe 10. You have a 20-minute block, but you probably maybe only see them for 10. Same thing, same service, just coded different based on the license type. Less time, more time, and you want to give me $60 for a session as an insurance company. And I know this client and this client, like, you know what I mean? Like, I see this client, I know the ups and downs, and you want me to coordinate care. You want me to talk to the physician. You want me to talk to their nutritionist. You want me to do all of these things as a provider that accepts insurance. And then you want to give me crumbs.
But even as a field, I think that's the part where it would be nice for folks that have been in the field for a long time
Hmm.
that are supervising or teaching folks from different generations to help with unionizing. We
Yeah,
don't have anything to
yeah.
say this isn't fair or this is something that could be improved on. I think it's been if you know somebody that knows somebody that's a part of this committee that does whatever it needs to change,
Hmm.
then
Yeah.
that's maybe a way. But like for example, recently for the EPPP, the examination that psychologists have to take to
Hmm.
get licensed, they were going to do two parts. So part one was just a multiple choice exam. That's already about $600 or
Yeah.
so. And the second part was going to be a little less, but about the same, like 400 or so. So that's what, $1,000 or more, not including study materials. So you're asking
Right.
me to do that maybe right after I get my degree, which I don't already have enough money to even pay for this. And the it doesn't make sense to do a second part. So a lot of people were complaining about it, sending letters, advocating that it wouldn't be great to do this. Thankfully, part two isn't going to be
Anything. Yeah.
enforced come 2026. But without this advocacy, or at least if we had a union, it would be a lot more streamlined. So we would
Absolutely.
have more opportunities to make more change in our field to be able to get more reimbursement too.
Yeah. Well, I know here in Texas, Texas Counseling Association, every so often we go down and we do advocate at the state level. And so I will give Texas Counseling Association that. Like they had us down there voting on rules, regulations, talking to the senators. They even taught us how to do it. So if you're not into
That's
politics, that is an organization that was very, very big on making sure that we were aware how to do this should something come up that we as a collaborative don't agree with. Okay, so we down to the last two questions, and I want to honor your time. I'm sorry. So
no worries.
gatekeeping is a it gatekeeping in mental health professions often starts long before licensure, embedded in the culture of graduate programs. How does this gatekeeping harm the very field it aims to protect, and what might a more inclusive approach look like?
For me, when I thought about this question, I thought of it with gatekeeping opportunities.
Hmm.
There's been a lot of times where I felt like there's some people that knew about opportunities that it would have been helpful for me to know at one point,
Hmm.
or mentors that I didn't feel like took the time to mentor.
Hmm.
So I didn't really know some of those things that would fit to what I want to do. So then I missed out on those things and sort of had to do a lot of my own researching. On top of that, I thought of in general just how academia is, and our research stays within academia and it doesn't necessarily it isn't shared to the community or other people that might be um, worth sharing to. Those two things were the main things that I thought about. But um, another thing too was gatekeeping in the sense of actually attaining the degree, meaning the GRE. Like we know that standardized testing usually isn't a good indicator of your success, but GRE has been so harped on in graduate school entry applications. But thankfully for me, the GRE wasn't considered because of the pandemic. But without that, I applied about four times before I got in. And that in itself says that it just, in general, I'm about to finish, but
Hmm.
the GRE is telling you that I'm not going to finish. But
Yeah.
clearly, it's not an indicator of attaining this degree. So those three things were the main things. But the GRE for me has been the biggest issue as far as gatekeeping.
The GRE is the biggest issue. The biggest
Hmm.
issue. I remember when I first came out of my master's program, I was like, I'm gonna go straight into the doctoral program because if I take a break, I ain't going back, right? Um,
Hmm.
anyway, that GRE was so hard.
Right, for no reason. We
Like,
don't even use
we
it
don't even do math.
at
I
all.
mean, we calculate our pay, but like
Hmm.
we don't even do this type of math. So what? And it yeah, we can start with the GRE. And then on top of that, I'm gonna do it today. I'm gonna have to do it today. So like remember when they started the DEI initiatives and schools were trying to be more inclusive and all the things, and they coupled everybody into BIPOC, right?
Hmm.
BIPOC did not open up more opportunities for Black students.
Right,
It
it
opened
didn't. It
up
was performative.
even more opportunities for other minority groups, which is fine. The issue is because we're all coupled together, we're going to meet this checkbox by admitting other populations that we believe to be more successful at finishing and that we believe that education is more important than the other populations, right? And so
Mm.
that's the other part of it. So it's like when we get these DI initiatives or these diversity based programs, who does it truly benefit? Now, I got into my master's program, look, straight paperwork, right? There was no interview, none of that. The doctoral programs, they did require interviews in person.
It's funny to travel.
Money, money, time, capacity. On top of that, it's like, yeah, but if I'm coming from low socioeconomic status and I have to go into this interview, my attire is not going to look like the other people in the room. My level of professional attire looks very different than someone else's level of a professional attire if I'm coming straight out of undergrad
Right.
with no money, no job, no nothing. I'm just a dollar in a dream, right? So then it's like that still sets me behind because when you look at me, you put me in this category when in reality that's not the category that I fit in. I'm very much well capable and able, but I'm also in a room with other people who are input into the BIPOC population, and I don't stand a chance.
Right. Hmm.
So yeah, those two are two big things. But then two, we don't have, like you said, if there are not minorities in higher education, teaching, advisors, the admissions team, then who's advocating for students that look like them to be included into the programming, right? But I digress on that question so we can get to this last question. So, for students considering graduate programs in mental health, what should they look for to avoid environments that might be toxic? And for those already in these programs, how can they protect their mental health while pushing through the system?
So, for folks that are considering grad programs in mental health, I think it's essential to look beyond the program's reputation and focus on the culture of the program. That being the faculty member that you want to be mentored by. How are they personally? If talking to them would be helpful, and I've done that a few times where I've met with a faculty member for folks that were quote unquote too busy or
Hmm.
sent somebody else, that also was a consideration for me. I Part of the main reason why I went for the program that I'm in now was the advisor that I was with at the time took his time to talk to me, explain a little bit more about the program, plugged me in with one of his students, and I spoke to the student also, and that helped me better understand just how the culture was. And she was honest, and that helped me so much. So, on top of talking to faculty members, talking to students that are already in the program is helpful. Also, for folks that are already in the program, I think back to community. Without finding your community, it may or may not be hard to thrive and succeed in the program. On top of that, I think setting boundaries would be helpful. That was something that I had to process again in my doc program. There's going to be opportunities that fly or come to you all the time, but you may or may not have the opportunity in the sense of physically or mentally being able to do that. And I had to have
Mhm.
serious conversations with myself. And my advisor was part of the reason why I had to consider these boundaries. If it wasn't for having these honest conversations with her, I would probably say yes to things that
Mhm.
wouldn't be helpful for me. So again, back to just having an advisor that is going to help you throughout this process. Without her being how she is, I don't know how I'll be here. And she's helped me not only grow professionally, but personally. And I think that
Yeah.
relationship is helpful and fruitful while you're in your program and if you're prospectively looking into one. And if you don't have an advisor that is helpful for you, back to community would be helpful
Mhm.
to have.
Yeah. I will say, yeah, that's amazing. Talking to former students, um, and professors, and if they're too busy, probably going to be your experience in the program. I would probably add programs that have a high level of students in the program, like the online programs. If they are admitting like 6 to 800 students per year semester, or if they're like start January 1st, if you apply by today, I'm not saying those programs can't be of quality, but what I am saying is you're a number at that point because you're making sure that the university is going to make that $90,000 that they're trying to get about you every year, right? So keeping that in mind, just being mindful of like how many students are in the program. Like a program with like 100 students or maybe 75, that's not bad. A program with 6 students, it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing.
Mhm. And I can say with doc programs, usually most cohorts will be about six-ish, but
6 to 12, I think I've
give
seen.
mhm. But given my experience, my cohort's a cohort of three.
Hmm.
Because of some things that happened with some people that were supposed to join with us, but then all of the requirements were on the three of us. And it was a lot to parse through that and divvy that up. So it was a lot more stuff that we had to do and a lot more pressure. But yeah, just some things to consider, just what that looks like as far as requirements and how
Hmm.
that's split up between your cohort.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I want to say that I'm proud that you're still fighting the good fight and that you're still going through your
Thank you.
program. Um,
Appreciate that.
I hate that you're going to still have to do internship after graduation, or yeah, you know what I'm trying to say, your clinical hours,
Postdoc. Hmm.
which is a whole nother thing. Um, and I am going to continue to pray for you in your journey. I'm so excited
Thank
that
you.
you're going through. I do have like a Rolodex of psychologists. So if you need to connect with psychologists that look like you, or just other psychologists that are, down to earth, looking to mentor like upcoming psychologists, I definitely can connect you with 1 or 2 people. Um,
I'm grateful
and
for that. I'd appreciate
yes.
it.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today. I know we rambled a lot, but
No, no worries.
we talked about it in an hour, but there is so much more that can be said about how much work is put into becoming a clinician. And not only do we have to advocate within the system and the industries that we work within, we have to advocate in the education system, and then we still have to advocate in our direct services, our day to day. Whether we work for ourselves or whether we're working for a different organization, we have to be very mindful about advocating for ourselves, because if people don't know, they don't know that the struggle is there. So,
Mhm.
I know we kind of mentioned the pricing and like people lowballing I get it. Nobody wants to pay for therapy. We wish it could be free, but the amount of debt,
It's a lot.
like what is it? Medical school students typically come out with like 250,000 on average.
Mhm.
That's what licensed mental health professionals are coming out with. Now that
Right.
they've changed and made it more, they've added more requirements. I think, right before we probably got our degrees and stuff, it had just changed from like a 48 hour program to a 60-hour program.
Mhm.
And then it went from 2 years to become a supervisor to 5 years to become a supervisor in some states. Like, and every time it changes, it doesn't get easier, it gets harder.
Right. And there's no compensation that's considered when these changes are made.
All right. So
It's,
tell us your handles. Can you spell it out for us again? That
oh,
way,
sure.
if someone's interested, they can reach out and then just remind us of the states. And if you take insurance, let us know.
So handles are Danisha C. Baro. That's DAN as in Nancy, ISHA, C as in cat, BARO. And I am in my private practice, seeing folks from Texas and New York, taking insurances of Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I know we talked a lot and we went over, but I definitely appreciate
Right.
you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. It was great talking to you, and
Thank
we'll
you.
keep in touch.
All righty.